like to keep things on schedule, so 6:30 we're going to get a good start here. Welcome all of you for coming up here. What we have is the final presentation from CGR. I'll let them introduce themselves here in a moment. I just want to let everybody know where the fire exits are, straight out the front and around the corner over here. Bathrooms are over here. Ladies and men's rooms right over here. Need anything? Let me know. With that said, Paul?
Thanks, Bob. Good evening. Everyone hear me okay in the back? All right. My name is Paul Bishop. I'm a principal with CGR. I lead our local government and our public safety practice. With me tonight is Jim Casson, who is one of our consultants who worked with me on this project. We both have been involved in EMS for a number of years, a number of decades. What's that? Okay, well, I'll be careful. I won't go any further with that. We have also done similar types of projects to this in about half dozen counties in New York State and a half dozen towns as well. So we're familiar with EMS systems overall, the wide variety that there are in New York State. What our goal is tonight is to walk through what we learned, what our process was here in Lewis County, and then we'll get to our recommendations. Now, looking around the room and checking with Bob, my understanding is probably about 3/4 of you have seen the first 15 of these 35 slides, or not even 35, maybe it's about 25 slides. So I'm going to cruise through some of that initial data because this is telling the story of Lewis County EMS that you live every day. But we want to let you know how we got to where we got. So, and I'll pause at a couple of points for questions as we go, and we're going to get started. So, the discussion tonight, we're going to give an overview of the project, how we got started, what we did to begin with, our methodology. We're going to go into our detailed findings. This is a 167-page report, right? We're not going to go through each page. We're going to hit the highlights. We want to make sure you understand what we understood so that where we made our recommendations from, and then we'll get into the recommendations and we'll get into the questions, or leave plenty of time for questions. So we started September 2025. We responded to an RFP. We got contracted. We began in September. We interviewed everyone who provides service in the county, those who provide service in the county from outside, as well as those who are in. We also spoke with a number of staff in Lewis County government, from the county manager to the head of the hospital and different offices in the county government. We collected and analyzed a lot of call data. We went through 4 full years worth of your calls for service data. We took a look at what kind of calls you respond to, who responds to them, when you respond to them. We delivered our interim draft report on a much less sunny evening in February, and then we were here earlier today. I spoke to the legislature for about 20 minutes this afternoon, and now we're sharing this with you tonight. So what do we learn about EMS in Lewis County? You've got a lot of strong points. You've got a lot of things to be proud of, and we want to build on in the future, right? There's a lot of collaboration. There's a lot of longevity of service, a lot of interagency cooperation. There's strong local community support. Your towns and villages are giving you money to be able to continue to operate. There is good fiscal stability, and there's financial resourcefulness. But there are some cracks in that and some challenges, and we'll get to those in a little bit. Strong relationships with the County 911 Center and the Air Medical Services. Although those aren't your day-to-day, you don't think of that necessarily as your EMS system, that is a crucial part of your EMS system. As well as Lewis County General Hospital is a wonderful resource for you, serves as the receiving point as the majority of your 911 calls. And then they end up having to call on you, particularly Lewis County Search and Rescue, to do trips out. So this blue box on the side, right? Lewis County EMS faces many challenges. However, it's highly evident that the leadership and providers in the county care deeply about their work and want to ensure the highest standard of care. We want to highlight that. I want to make sure that we're starting from there. You guys have a position of strength and something really great to build on in the future. However, you've got challenges, and I don't think this is going to be news to any of you in the room. Right, you have staffing challenges. The number of volunteers is declining. We don't have great hard numbers on that. We tried, but New York State wasn't able to provide them in a timely manner. But everyone we spoke with, everyone during the interviews was able to share, you know what, we don't have as many people coming around as we used to, or those who are here aren't able to do as many hours as they used to do because they're working a second job or a third job. Costs are going up across the county for everything that it takes to operate an ambulance, and we said all that before all the gas prices and diesel prices started going up, right? So that's putting an even greater pressure on everybody. You lost one of your volunteer agencies. Harrisville Rescue Squad closed, and that created another gap in the system that had to be filled. And then there was a proposal from Lewis County Search and Rescue. There was some debate about the origin of the proposal. Regardless of what the origin was, it was made, and there was some discussion about it afterwards, where they proposed that one of the solutions would be for them to become the sole provider in the county for ambulance transport, and that municipalities would pay to support through them rather than the locals. This created a rift and some friction among the relationships in the community. And that is something that we had to consider and we heard about while we were doing our interviews during the process. So let's talk about the existing conditions. Nothing shocking here. There's 7 active agencies in the county, mostly volunteer. The one is combination, although heavily career staff. Work out of 7 bases. By your counts, there were 207 volunteers, 53 EMTs, 7 AEMTs, and 10 paramedics. The others are uncertified, whether it's a driver or somebody who's in training. The paid staff was 25, was what was reported to us. Again, this is a snapshot in time, so these numbers will fluctuate a little bit. There were 13 ambulances, but only 2 or 3 are staffed 24/7. The others are on call as needed when one of the 3,900 ambulance calls come in. The annual cost was about 1.4 million, although this was 2025 numbers and some folks were giving us round numbers and we're not sure that they're 100% right. And then there was the billing revenue largely from search and rescue. Then you have the out-of-county agencies that come in and respond and help answer the 911 calls, and you know where they're coming from, the different parts of the county. They are only about 10% of the call volume. This table appears in the report. Not going to go through it line by line, but this is the folks that are in county. These are the folks that are out of county. Thing I do want to highlight is the majority of the transports are handled by, and responses are handled by Lewis County Search and Rescue, 75%. So 3 out of 4 calls are handled, responses are handled by Lewis County Search and Rescue. Some of those are them on their own. Some of those are providing advanced life support to a BLS agency elsewhere in the county. And they do about 20% of the calls in the county are interfacility transports. This was an average of 5 years of data. So there is fluctuation year to year. This was a 5-year average. Let's see, I've hit all of these points. The number of interfacility transports being performed by Search and Rescue has decreased steadily between 2022 and 2025. That was our years that we were studying. It's about a 30% decrease, while the other calls they were responding to went up over that time. That was a decision that they wanted the hospital to use other transport providers for some of these long trips to Albany and elsewhere in the state that take up a lot of time. And then the next busiest agency was J.S. Coster Hose in Port Leyden, and they respond to 5%. So it's a big drop in the number of calls from one agency to the next. When your calls come in, you're looking at about 9.5 calls per day on average. Your busiest months, and these are incidents, not responses. So the difference being when there's a call that requires that has a BLS first responding, or has a BLS ambulance that's responding first, and then a paramedic unit is responding to provide that ALS care, that's 2 responses but 1 incident. Or if you have an accident that has 3 or 4 victims, that's 1 incident with 3 or 4 responses. So this is a count of incidents, so if you're checking my math, that's why it doesn't all add up. But there are about 9.5 incidents a day on average. Your busiest months tend to be in the winter, but you do have some peaks on certain summer months. July, or it was May of 2023 was actually the busiest month that we had data for. When do your calls come in? They come in during the day. 8 to 4 is the busiest time frame. Actually, the noon to 4 p.m. is the busiest period of time. When we break the day into 6 segments, 2 on the overnight, 2 during the business day, 2 in the evening. These 3 are your busiest, so 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. And then we look at the overnight is when the call volume begins to drop. If you're a real data nerd, all of this for each agency is in the full report. So you can flip through to your agency, your town, or your neighboring agencies and see what they're doing. You can see how busy they are and where they are. So when we look at an EMS system and how you're responding, we like to focus on those high priority incidents. We identified what we consider to be high priority based on dispatch. I'm not going to read through the list, but it's the ones that you would say, oh wow, we really got to go help this person, not necessarily the person who's had stomach pain for 3 days, although those sometimes when you get there are true emergencies. But generally speaking, we're looking at heart attack, stroke, serious trauma. That accounts for about 25% of the call volume, right? Lower priority was about 75%, and that includes interfacility work goes into that 75%. So that's about 20% of the total. It gets lumped into that 75. Some of those we know are higher priority. Where are the calls? So when you look at the report, there is a URL that has an interactive map that you can go to and turn on the different layers, the layers of your agency, the layers of where each of the facilities are, and this, which is the heat map. And you can zoom in or zoom out to your community or the community you're interested in. These orange and yellow colors are the busiest areas, and we're right about there, right? But these lighter blue areas are where there are some calls, and these areas, there's hardly any. This is probably not a surprise to any of you, because that's where people live. EMS is a service for people, so where there are people are where we have calls. But this is just to give you an idea of where all the work is. And this, I believe, was just emergency calls in 2025. So we even filtered out the interfacility work out of the hospital. Biggest top 10 call natures in the county. Top 1 was interfacility, then sick, then fall, then trouble breathing. When you look at this, what's on this list, these top 10 account for 75% of the calls in the county. And this is based on the description at time of dispatch. So that's not necessarily what you found, right? We can all go for the fall and end up with it's a serious trauma, or some of us may have had that cardiac arrest that came in as a fall. But this gives us an idea of what the indications are at the time of dispatch. So, the true life-threatening ones, the breathing problems, the chest pain, and the unconscious are all smaller in percentage than falls and sick person. Again, we have that broken down by agency so you can see what your own agency is doing. This is a pie chart that shows the share of high priority incidents in 2025. So just looking at the quarter of calls that are high priority, we identify that breathing trouble is 23%, chest pain is 18%, Fortunately, cardiac arrest is only 3% of that 25% of high priority calls. So it gets kind of smaller as we go on here. But that was just, again, this is all data that helps us understand what's going on in your system and how to be able to make some recommendations going forward. Took a look at response times. Now, when we look at response times, we consider what is the full response time. So from the time the 911 dispatcher enters the call to the time that an ambulance reports that they are on scene. Sometimes people only consider the travel time. So that's the time from when the unit starts going to when it gets on scene. But we feel it's important to consider it from the perspective of the caller, which is the person who's saying, hey, I need the help. How long does it take to get there? And we choose not to look at averages. We look at percentiles because we believe that's a better factor, because you can have an average that throws everything off. So you can have, if you say that spread of calls, you can have one outlier that really drags your average up or down. But we don't take a look at that. We took a look at the median. In this case, we're showing 75%. So for all of these, this whole table is showing that 75% of the time, these agencies were on scene in less than that period of time. So if we look at the busiest time of day in the afternoon, Beaver Falls, Turin, and Port Leyden had some of the faster response times. So from the time the 911 caller was picked up at dispatch to the time an ambulance got on scene, these were all in the 18, 19-minute time frames, 75% of the time. And then we had some longer ones. The busiest agency in the county, Lewis County Search and Rescue, was at about 23 minutes. When you consider that some of these calls for them were not their calls in their primary service area, but they're responding to be the paramedic somewhere else in the county, having a somewhat longer response time, even though they're staff, is something that we would expect. And again, in a rural community, having from the time the 911 caller connects to the time an ambulance is on scene, these seem to us to be reasonable, but maybe there's room for an improvement. How can we, if this was a cardiac arrest, would we be happy with a 20-minute response time? And the answer is no. So what can we do to make sure in a system overall that we are having a faster response to those true critical calls? Again, this breaks down for each agency in each time frame, so you can take a look at it in the report. Questions on the state of what it is today? Okay. So our recommended actions fall into 4 categories. And there is, the transport model is the one that we'll probably spend the most time on tonight as I describe it, and then we'll get questions on it. But I don't want to sleep on the other 3, right? You cannot have an effective transport system if you don't have people to staff the ambulances. That's what we're talking about with workforce sustainability. We need to have that next generation of provider available and ready and trained to respond. You need to have coordination in your system to make sure it's functioning well together. That's what system operations is about. And finally, there's the funding. Where's the money going to come from? Because these things, some of these improvements that we're talking about, some of these changes we're talking about are not going to be free. And I understand that, but it is something that we're suggesting we lay out some of the options that the county would have to do this. And realize that any of the recommendations we make tonight are not decided on tonight, right? There's going to be debate, discussion among the legislature, among the leaders that have to implement it. It's our hope that we would be able to help with implementation. We've already been talking with folks about some of the implementation plans that there would be, but these are tough discussions and tough decisions that'll have to be made. So our first one, and this was not an easy one for us to get to, but we feel that there's a gap in the ability of this system to have reliable, consistent transport, particularly interfacility, And so our first recommendation is EMS transport with an ambulance based out of Lewis County General Hospital. Why? There's the need to support that interfacility work and as a backup resource to 911. Being based at and affiliated with the hospital has a number of advantages. One, there's an existing infrastructure for simple management tasks, for being able to maintain equipment, but there's also the opportunity for these providers who may only be asked to respond on a call 2 or 3 times a shift to do things in between. And when they're stationed at a hospital, they can be asked to assist with patient care, they can be asked to do certain things in the emergency department or other places in the hospital while they're waiting for the next call. So that brings some additional support in the hospital, and then they're available for that work. Also, there's some continuity. If they're asked to be doing the interfacility work, they may already have been in touch with that patient. There would be billing revenue that will support more than half of our estimated operational costs, and we'll go into that cost modeling on the next slide. It's not going to cover all of it, but we believe that there would be enough to cover a good portion of it. We're not blind to the fact that there are substantial capital costs, right? There's the cost of the ambulance and the equipment, and there's a place to park them, right? So these are all costs that would be a part of this. We outline some of them, but we don't go into granular detail on all of them. But we see that there's an immediate need for supplemental ambulance, and there's the potential for the need for full service in the future, but we don't think it's there right now. We think there's a need for some supplemental ambulance service in the county as we sit here tonight. So we describe it as 2 potential models. And there's variation on all of them, but we had to put our stakes down in 2 places to provide cost modeling. So that first one is what we term the supplemental system. 1 additional ambulance to our system operating 24/7, and another ambulance that would be available during the busiest hours. We built the finances at a 16-hour model, but that could be 12, it could be 8, it could be 10 hours a day. If it's at what we modeled it at, that's 13 full-time employees would be needed to staff that schedule. The cost would be about $1.7 million, and this has greater detail in the report for those who want to take a look at it. We believe there would be about $930,000 in revenue from billing. We based that on about 1,093 transports, or 1,090, something like that.
1095.
1095, and about $850 in revenue per transport. We believe that revenue number, the patient billing, is a little on the conservative side, but we think that call volume is there to be able to take in the county right now. So what are the costs to set that up? It's at least $750,000 for that capital cost to get going. And $1.5 million if you're going to put 2 ambulances on the road that are paramedic equipped and staffed. Because to do that, you probably need to have 3 vehicles fully equipped and ready to go. And we did not include facility needs. So what if there's a dramatic shift in the system, right? Hiring staff at the county hospital may destabilize the workforce that currently exists in the county. We acknowledge that. And it's kind of an uncomfortable recommendation to make, but it is one that we think is an appropriate one. And if that happens, the full-scale provider that you have right now may have a real challenge in continuing their operations. So the county needs to think about what would it be if they had to do it all. So we modeled what it would be to have 3 ambulances 24/7, which is 1 more than there is today. And an additional ambulance during the day. That's 27 full-time employees, about $3.8 million in operations to make that work. And when we talk about operations, we're talking about payroll, we're talking about disposable supplies, fuel, insurances, rent, that type of cost for an agency. And again, the billing would be able to cover probably about half. So we did, roughly 1,100 transports for the first model This is about 2,200 transports. Right, the costs also jump up for capital needs. And we did not do a facilities cost forecast. So I'm going to pause here for questions. Yes, sir.
So out of that $1.7 million of operations,
Yes.
is that considered out of the current budget, or is that a tax increase?
So we believe that you'd have the revenue to cover the $930,000 of that $1.7 million, leaving you about an $800,000 gap, $850,000 gap. And we'll go into how you can cover that in our last section about
And that's
finances.
only being serviced out of the hospital.
That is a resource that would be based at the hospital and be able to respond throughout the county.
Throughout the county, all the way to Osceola?
It would be based at the hospital and be able to respond everywhere throughout the county. That's,
Okay.
So that's running both inter-facility transports and e-calls.
so the focus on this is in the supplement, the focus on the supplemental is being able to handle the interfacility volume, and as resources are available to supplement the 911 work.
Paul, built into this, adding your 1.7 million in operations, can you tell me, is built into that number replacement of vehicles every year? And what time frame do you have set for replacement of vehicles, monitors, stretchers, things like that? What are those time frames? What's built in each year for that equipment stuff?
So the question for those of you in the back who might not hear it is, in that 1.7 operational cost, do we include a sinking fund for capital replacement? And the answer is yes. And off the top of my head, I can't tell you, but I think it's about $250,000 a year that we would put in the sinking fund.
In this model, we budgeted 400,000,
Which one, though?
the full scale. So say 250 in the other one. On replacement of vehicles, I would look at 7 years, but again, it depends. You do a lot more mileage than I'm used to doing, okay? Depends on wear and tear. An option on that is also doing remounting, which can save about 20 to 25% versus buying another new ambulance.
Right.
The monitors, you can figure 10-year window.
Yeah, I'd say you're safe probably at 10 years, but it depends on model, right? And how long they service them, but yeah, I'd say 10 years probably safe.
Again, you're back to wear and tear also.
And you're upstate New York, so it's not typically, I think a lot of these ambulances will go the mileage. They'll go the 7 years on mileage, but they won't go the 7 years on the body. The salt just eats them. And then if you go, depending on what type of rig you're going with, if you're going with the smaller Ford Transits, you're not going to get 7 years out of them. You'd be lucky to get 3 or 4 years out of it.
Actually, we did not look at that in the model. Looking at your demographics, your winners, whatever, we would be looking at type 1 all-wheel drive ambulances and possibly a type 3 that could also be put in probably 10 months out of the year.
Mm-hmm.
But we definitely recognize a type 1 all-wheel drive ambulance is a need in this county.
And we got recent cost estimates from a neighboring county or nearby county that just put those in service. Yes, ma'am.
So does this take into account the ALS agency that's already in southern Lewis County, and the dispatch would just go to the closest available?
So our vision on the number one, the supplemental, right, is this is a resource that is, the primary focus is helping the hospital with its need. And it would be a resource that would be available when it's not needed for that as it's needed elsewhere in the system. Our thought as we were developing this is it's not that first tier for any response to a 911 call.
And Paul, when you were developing this, and I think we talked about this before, did we get a number of interfacility transports that are not handled by an entity in the county? What percentage of interfacility transports are not? So in other words, to justify the need for this, because this whole model, in my opinion, surrounds the fact that the hospital wants to get transports out, and I understand that. But what percentages of those transports are going out by other than a county entity?
Josh, that's a detail that I cannot answer off the top of my head. I know we looked at it in the report. Jim, I don't know if you...
I can give some generic, I can't give you to the nth degree. There's about 50 to 60 depending on the month. And we looked at, again, 4 years data, so it's up and down. So even at 50, we were, based on talking to Marcellus, seems to be the other resource that the county hospital will contact for services. Depending on the year, or looking at the data, about 25, maybe 30%.
Per month?
Overall, the whole, for the year. So I would say 6 to 650 a year, they're doing upwards of 30% of that.
So they're doing a third of 600.
That's
They're doing 200 a year?
That was the generic
I
information.
can promise you that's not even close. I'm not debating, I'm telling you, I've done the numbers. I pulled them, that's not even remotely close.
Is it up or down, Josh?
Way down,
It's under that 200?
way under.
Okay.
I can promise you that LifeNet does almost as many interfacility transports out of that hospital as Marcellus does.
We do have the data in the report on both air medicals, both Mercy Flight Central and Air Methods. We went back 3 years, 4 years, I can't remember. We actually broke it out, 911 scene calls versus interfacility transfers. So that's in the report. I just don't remember those numbers off the top of my head right now.
And again, this is a big deal not to have hardcore numbers to justify that. And I'm telling you, I took and pulled every bit of data we had, and I pulled out everything from left AMA, Marcellus, Carthage, you name it. Every one of them, I pulled that out and looked at the numbers, because to me this was alarming as well. And I tell you, it wasn't even close to that. Not even close. If they took between 5 and 10 a month, that was a ton, and it wasn't even those numbers. I'd be happy to share that too if you need.
We can look at it.
I have another question.
Yes.
As it stands right now, are other agencies allowed to take transfers if search and rescue can't, for instance?
So search and rescue, as having an operating certificate for Lowville, has to be called first. They do have a standing agreement for long distance ones that it's okay to call Marcellus first. Am I correct, that agreement still exists?
Yes.
Okay.
And we're even able to, that's what I'm getting at.
Well, if they are not available, and actually you can always transport back to your own community, right? Your operating certificate allows you to do transports that either originate or end in your community. So if you had a resident who wanted to be transported back to their house by ambulance and they contacted you, you are authorized by the state to do that.
The state also has relaxed a little bit. If a CON holder is not able to provide the service on an interfacility, they can go to another agency that's a non-CON holder. The state recognizes we need to move the patients,
And
otherwise we bottleneck or we're doing not the care that the patient needs.
And Marcellus is an example of that. They do not have an operating certificate for the county.
But they have to give search and rescue first shot. If they can't, or it's a long delay, then they can go to somebody else.
Bob, are you handing Jim something that I should answer or not?
No, that's the data.
Okay.
I just pulled it out with the whole thing.
All right, so moving on to the workforce sustainability. I am thrilled to walk into this building tonight and see that there's a classroom for EMS education. That in having a BOCES that is doing EMT education is exciting and needs to be supported, and you should be encouraging people from your communities to attend it because it is shown in a number of places in New York State to have a definite impact on getting people into the field and staying in the field. And that's great. I'm glad you're doing it, and please continue to invest and support in that. But we need to make sure when you look at people who are working for search and rescue, who are working for the helicopter services that live in this community, who they started as volunteers. And we're not getting as many young volunteers in the door. So where's our next generation of EMS provider coming from? That is what we talk about when we want to strengthen that EMS workforce pipeline. We can't just wait for someone to get struck by lightning and say, hey, I want to go become an EMT. We need to be out there actively, and it's not just the people in this room, it's a community as a whole, that this is a viable career option, because it is much more so than when I started as a volunteer. There is a need to facilitate that EMS training. There's good cooperation and coordination that happens through the regional council, through the community college and the regional core sponsors. You want to make sure to build on that, and that it's easy that when somebody comes into the community or says, you know what, I want to become an EMT, they can sign up for a class and they can get into it. There's a need for an EMS instructor coordinator that's available to facilitate continuing medical education, make sure that our current providers are able to retain that. We want to make it easy as we can, and having an instructor coordinator on the county payroll that is responsible for making sure that EMTs and others in the county are able to keep their certification is important. One of the concerns that we heard was it's expensive for the EMS workforce to live here in the county. And investigating ways to support EMTs and paramedics living in the county is something that should be considered as part of the solution to making sure you have enough providers. And that basic life support first responder program, when we talk about wanting to make sure we have a faster than 20-minute response time, we want to make sure that we have BLSFR. We have people who are available, trained, equipped. We don't need to send them on every lift assist, right? We want to save them for the most critical, most likely to be a serious call where their help is going to be most needed. But we want to integrate them, and oh, by the way, maybe if we can get them to take a CFR class in a few years, we can get them into an EMT class, and then we can get them into the profession. Talking about system operations. Bob and Jen were incredibly valuable to us during this project. They clearly work hard, but Bob made a comment to me this afternoon that was really striking. There's a third of the people who think that he's the EMS coordinator, a third think he's the fire coordinator, and a third think he's the emergency manager. Not enough people realize he's all three and responsible for all those really large portfolios of work. Grateful that you have the two of them here doing this work, but it's too much for them to be the EMS coordinator alone. It's not just Paul saying this. This is something that's coming out from the New York State Rural EMS Task Force, that this should be something every county in New York State should have, is a dedicated EMS coordinator. And okay, maybe there's not as much work in this county as there is in some others. Maybe they could also be that instructor coordinator, but you need to have a person who's got that flag of, I'm going to them to be that EMS contact. We're talking about some expensive stuff. Your legislators are going to have to make some hard calls. They're going to respond to the people in the community that say, hey, this is something that we really need. You need to advocate for that. Take a look at the power phone call triage system. This was a switch that was made at the 911 center a handful of years ago. Pardon me for not remembering exactly how many.
I think it was early 2025.
But it is a step down in the quality of care. If you think of the EMS quality of care starting from the time someone picks up the phone, this is a step backwards. The prior system, medical priority consulting, or
International Association of Emergency Dispatch.
Yeah, but the
ProQA.
ProQA was the software program that showed up on their screen. That was a well-researched and validated triage system that helped prioritize that call and help you figure out whether or not you needed an EMT or a paramedic at it. Unfortunately, the power phone doesn't do that as well, and that's requiring more ALS responses than are probably needed at the moment. It also keeps you from being able to do things like nurse triage, where you could identify, hey, this person doesn't even need to go to the hospital today. They can take an aspirin and go in and see their doctor in the morning. And that's something that you can do when you have the validated systems available to you. And finally, you need to develop and support the future EMS leaders. This is something that is seen across New York State, but we need, and probably the country, but I'm most familiar with this state, we need to make sure that next generation of EMS leader is getting developed, getting those experiences, learning how to lead an organization, budget, plan, and fill out the state paperwork of all awful things that you have to do. But making sure we get that next generation available, because one day we're all going to want to retire. All right, so let's talk about the money. Ambulances will be able to bill, but billing won't fully cover operating costs in a rural community. Other revenue is needed, period. So what can we do? You can pursue a motor vehicle registration tax. This is not going to be a high revenue generator. It's based on the number of vehicles registered in your county, but it is something that's done in at least one county in New York State where there's an extra $10 for every vehicle registered there, and that money goes directly to EMS to support their BLS first response system. You could designate a portion of sales or occupancy tax to EMS. That's great. Those taxes have some variability to them. Anyone who remembered COVID, right? The occupancy tax, what happened to it that year? It cratered. So if your system was totally dependent on that, it could have been problematic. So let's look at property tax. So property tax, how we did our math here, is we gathered the equalized taxable assessed value for the county. If anyone really wants to get into it, the questions about equalization, we'll go break out the algebra books, but that is essentially the market value of a property in the county. The census tells us that it's slightly less than $200,000, so to make our math easy for everyone, we use $200,000 as our example. The report has the full table that goes in a variety, but for tonight we're talking to $200,000. So if we were to raise, so looking at this table here, right, property tax impact, the amount needed. So as we're talking, this supplemental service, Model 1, if you needed to raise $800,000 solely on increasing your property tax in the county, it would cost a $200,000 home $48 a year, or about $1 a week. If you were looking at a $1.8 million subsidy, which is what that full model would be, we're talking about $2 a week for that median home of $200,000. Now I realize, there are the larger landholders in the county. That's going to hit them a lot more. I know there are people who are on a fixed income that every dollar matters, but we want to be able to illustrate this, that this is the scale that we're talking about when you take that cost and spread it throughout the county. Why use property tax and taxable assessed value? That is how the county provides a lot of services. Is it the best, most fair? Could there be a different way of saying this town's going to use it more and that town's going to use it less? Yes. You think the debate about whether or not to create an ambulance service is hard? Trying to come up with disparate levels of funding across the county would be more challenging. We use this as kind of that mayonnaise approach where there's a lot of things that are paid for: the 911 center, the sheriff's office, the jail, Department of Social Services, emergency management. are all part of the general property tax levy. So that's why we use that model here. Questions?
So when you figured out that general tax levy, you looked, there was an ambulance service up there that was 30 minutes on the short side, 42 minutes on the long side.
Yes.
Okay? Took me an hour and 3 minutes to get here
Okay.
from Osceola today. And you use the mayonnaise effect. Okay?
Right.
We're not driving to this hospital. We're not flying to this hospital.
You're going somewhere else.
We're going south. We're going to Syracuse.
Yeah.
So then there's a bunch of neighboring towns in that district down that way, right? So you're basically pulling about $34,000 on the lower end side from the town that has a budget of $400,000 in your model,
Yes.
okay? That is never going to use the service. So, as you take a look at that, it would also increase our response time. I knew you didn't know where Osceola was when I asked you if it was from Osceola. And this meeting's not turning into Osceola. But this is by being the south end of the town, or of the county. It's gonna add 15 more minutes of response time for a transport. And you're gonna take $34,000 from the town, right? So your mayonnaise effect doesn't work.
So can I say I understand? And what I think would be a better solution, but isn't currently allowed in New York State law, but if your county were to advocate for it with a number of other counties, and I can list them off, is something called a county EMS district, right? You can create a fire district or a town ambulance district that's based on a certain number of properties. But right now in New York State, a county cannot create a district that is based on a specific number of properties. So what they could, if you were allowed to do that, you could say these are the communities with which we want to pay a top tier of this tax, and these other counties are just going to get a little bit. They still need to be taxed because we need to cover that EMS coordinator. They can benefit from that EMS education, and we need to make sure that the agreement of, because who's coming into your town right now for the service? Is it Boonville? Camden? Okay. So they're coming in, you're paying them right now to make sure you get a good response. And maybe the county tax levy could be the one who would start picking up that cost for you.
So we're paying them to get a, on average, 40-minute response.
Yeah.
Right?
Is that how long it takes Camden to get there?
The chart up there said 30 minutes to 43 minutes.
Yeah.
Or 31 was the quickest to 43, right? But just, I know we're the bastard in the whole group, right? But I'm here representing that town.
And yeah, and it's important to think about how do we get the best service for everybody, because that's what you're trying to do here, right? It's not just the hot spot where all the calls are. We want everyone to be able to go to bed at night thinking that if I had to call or my loved one has to call, that we're going to get a good response. So how can we design a system that's going to be effective for you too?
So if I do simple math with your mayonnaise effect, $1.7 million divided by 70 or 23 towns is $73,000. Just give us the stipend credit. We'll pay for our own ambulance service.
Or we do it based on population, which is another way, right? So that the town could be given X amount to be able to fund an ambulance service. So again, these are policy decisions that can be made. So an example of how a county funds their EMS system is what happens in Madison County. Madison County has two tiers of service. They have a base tier of service that everyone pays for. And then the towns that have an ambulance stationed in it have to pay a higher tier of service.
We'll take an ambulance all day long for an extra $34,000.
$34,000 doesn't buy you much of an ambulance, unfortunately.
I get it, but I'm just saying that's what it is, right? Based upon 860 properties.
So, and that's, so there are concrete examples of creative problem solving that's being done in different places. what other neighbors do you have, or is there, would you be able, if you were able to give Camden more money, could you get better service?
No. They suck.
What they do have down there is they have Redfield Rescue come in from Oswego County, and they are their BLSFR agency. And I believe that they're probably, 15, 20 minutes?
We had the fire out of the house. We had the vacuum cleaned up, the extinguishers put away before they showed up on site, and saved them out lots. So,
And that was Redfield?
Yeah.
Yeah. They're 20,
we're looking at NOCO or NICO on Pulaski.
Yep.
So,
Understood.
So these are valuable conversations to have, and maybe that's the conversation that is done at the county level and said, okay, we're raising this tax on assessed value, and a lot of it's going to be supporting this service that's covering many people, but for those who it's not covering, how can we help them, right? Because there's parts of the county where the best response is going to be out of the county. Carthage, for example, is just over the border, and they are able to respond to certain segments of the county pretty quickly, but they're never going to be a county agency, and it wouldn't make sense to put a county resource up there if you could do something to make sure to support them in their response. So I appreciate your concern, and I don't want to be dismissive of it, and I think we do want to make sure that there's a solution that is helpful to everybody.
Can you explain the motor vehicle registration tax a little bit more?
Sure.
And would that apply to like boats and motorcycles and snowmobiles and side-by-sides? Or is it just motor vehicles?
It's local legislation, so you get to, I believe you can choose the vehicles that you're going to have it applied to. I've got to go look at my notes just to the county.
And is that comparable to the property tax
So,
option, or not even close?
yeah. It's Shenango County is the one that does it. They have about twice your population. So if the number of motor vehicles matches per capita, right, they're able to raise about $320,000 on that. With, depending on the type of vehicle, heavier vehicles pay more, lighter vehicles pay less. It's a $5 or a $10 charge per vehicle every time it's registered. They make $320,000 a year. Doing really easy math, maybe you're getting $150,000 a year here. So it's not a lot, but is it enough to say fund an EMS coordinator position and an EMS instructor position? Yeah. Other questions? Yes?
Is there any way to tap into some windmill money?
I am not familiar enough with the different streams of revenue that come into your county coffers. The gentleman one row behind you is.
I can address that a little bit. Those are pilot agreements, which are payment in lieu of taxes, and we are looking to see if, for example, the solar farm that the governor just approved up in Krogan will generate a pilot payment, and that could be targeted to this problem. So we are trying to find some creative ways to look at how do we fund something like this. And short-term rentals, right? New York State just required that all short-term rentals and Airbnbs pay a short-term rental tax. We're thinking that that's going to generate a couple $100,000. So that's another potential. And there's some justification for that because some of the other counties that have looked at the short-term rental tax have said we have to provide a disproportionately higher level of service because of the tourists that come here. So shouldn't they pay a portion of that cost, right? So that's where the short-term rental tax comes in.
what if a town already has a short-term rental? Does the county gonna jump up over the top of that?
The state already has.
No, but if a town or a county has a permit fee, is the county gonna jump on top of paying that?
It's a state law. This New York State passed a law that the state, you have to remit to the Airbnb, the platform,
Correct.
and it goes to the county, not to the town.
But there's towns that have permit fees for inspections.
Yeah, this is not an inspection fee. This is an actual percentage of the rental.
That's the bed tax.
Correct.
Other questions? I've got nothing else.
Okay. Well,
That's the end of that's the end of your presentation, everything's done?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so I had something I wanted to say to the end. So my question was, when I proposed the countywide system, I proposed a 4-ambulance system, okay? Which would put ambulances in the south, put them in the north, and put 2 central. That way we could get closer to the Osceolas, the Harrisvilles, and have 2 central, one to cover interfacility transports, and then you had the mobility of each one to stage, whether it be mid-place, depending on where call volume is, to cover all that. Why did we decide that that wasn't a good model? Because like we're struggling to hit, like if we're trying to, and you said it in here, we know that if you put an ambulance base, just a part-time ambulance base at the hospital, all they do is interfacility. We got a couple of problems there. One, when you take that interfacility revenue out, you're going to choke search and rescue right down to the point where they're not going to operate, right? You're going to get one crew who's not going to be able to cover everything because the call volumes will, we can't predict that. We have 2, 3, 4 calls at the same time. We don't have the manpower. It'll justify a hospital-based system because now that they're taking that revenue away, they have to respond to other calls, and then that municipal CON will, basically be easier to get after 2 years. That whole system goes away, and you choke the agency that's been here for 50 years down to inoperability, right? So with that said, that model right there is just going to choke out the one agency that's been covering as it stands. Whereas the model, and whether it be, it was posed as search and rescue takes, everything. To me, it doesn't matter. It's one entity. And we had talked about it being a county entity staged in multiple locations, right? To cover those distances. Still cover the interfacility transport. Still have the additional manpower to cover those areas. But right now, if we're centralizing 2, maybe 3 crews out of the hospital, we are so far from the other sides of the county, those people are in trouble. If we look at our response times now, they would be 2 to 3 times that because of the call volumes up in West Leiden and Harrisville and Osceola. So I don't understand where the hospital-based system, other than protecting the hospital's interfacility transports, which is why I asked about the numbers, because I felt like when I read this, that's what really this does, is it protects the hospital. It does not protect the people of Lewis County. That's my beef. Why did we move away from that? Or how does this plan truly cover the people in Osceola, Harrisville, West Line, and there? How does this protect them?
I appreciate the question. And I understand what your initial proposal was. Mm-hmm. And we did not cost out, actually we did, but we didn't present as a recommendation a 4-vehicle system. Actually we did. That is the supplemental.
Yeah, 3 324s and a 16.
Yeah.
As based out of the hospital.
No, they could be moved around.
They're not stationed entirely at the hospital.
Okay.
We're not getting, we're not saying what ambulance to buy or what monitor to purchase. We're not saying where to park the ambulance.
Okay, gotcha.
Right? We are saying that there's certain economies of scale being a part of the hospital. Mm-hmm. And so that's where that second model is, what if search and rescue goes out of business? What would the county operation look like? So that's what it's there for.
So then built into there is obviously, what we didn't discuss is obviously brick and mortars or buildings or things like that that you have to put up and things like that, right? Additional expenses on top of what,
Yes and no. If, let me be clear on that. It was through a hospital-based system, some of those capital costs are already there. There may be space there to do this without having to capitalize a new building. The ability to buy medical supplies through the hospital is going to be a lot more competitive than retail or creating another account through Boundtree, Savic, whoever, okay? Also, there's other, I assume they have a cascade system there. That's another cost. There's costs, if it was through the hospital, wouldn't have to be with a startup of a countywide or a county-based independent EMS system where, yes, they would need a building, they would need a lot of other ancillaries. And to be truthful, we did price that out because you gave us some data, and I put that side by side with my original concept based on what we read in the presentation that you did at the county about a year ago. And there was a big price difference, to be truthful.
based on, was it, I mean, granted, what are you using for labor rates?
That
was a big piece of what
yes, you said to me, you wanted to pay paramedics $50 an hour.
Correct. You're gonna shoot for the moon, right? You gotta run the best
But it's
now.
not sustainable.
So our model for price for
Was
the
$33 an hour.
thank you.
And where did I get that number from? I took the city of Rome and the city of Watertown's IFF contracts. I split the difference. That's where I got $33 an hour for a paramedic. In my opinion, and I worked for both EMS and fire in my career, I believe a paramedic should be paid the same as a career firefighter EMT when you look at skill sets. Okay, the amount of training and the different things. Yes, a paramedic with being the field doctor, so to speak, but a career firefighter today, their initial academy with hazmat, special rescue skills, the whole bit. It's a pretty even balance there. That's where I came up with that number to utilize in our estimates.
So you would base a paramedic to a firefighter versus a paramedic to an RN?
So we did also look at the county's CSEA contract. And we had conversations with Mr. Hunt about which tier do we think it would be in. And we did not have an actual formal response from HR as to which tier it would be, but it was in that range of about $33 as to the tier for the paramedic and this slightly lower tier for the EMT. Again, it is included in the report. Those tiers, I don't know them off the top of my head, but we were using the CSEA contract tiers as ballpark and relatively equivalent titles.
Because when I pulled the numbers I pulled the actuals for the RNs in the ER. So,
But you also said to me when we sat at Search and Rescue and did the initial interview, you talked about travel nurses. Yes, that was very high during COVID, but that number has dropped from what the county hospital staff told us when we interviewed them. That number is way down.
in which way maybe, but again, like I said, the numbers, I didn't pull a number out of the hat. I went and pulled all the RNs in the ER and I said, okay, what's their average hourly wage, and that's where I came up with.
I appreciate that, and I do think there's a need for further conversation about what's the right way to fix the system that there is here today. Right? We provided 2 recommendations for the county to consider. You're absolutely correct. You have a service that has been doing this for 50 years. But as we outlined, and there's not a dispute, there's cracks in that system.
Without a doubt.
And when we're trying to look 5, 10, 15 years down the road, how are we going to get the best system that's most sustainable for the residents and visitors to this community? And we laid out 2 models to be considered. You laid out a 3rd model to be considered. Is there some way to get between those 2? I think there might be. But that would require a lot of what ifs and a lot of negotiation that as an outside consultant, I don't have the power to do. Right? I can lay out, this is what we think a county system would cost. We know what you think your system would cost. how can we get somewhere in between?
Right.
That's still gonna serve the residents of the county and the visitors to this community and be sustainable for our kids.
Which I completely understand. And to be honest with you, this is my last project in EMS. I'm done with it. The only thing that I want to see is that we have a sustainable program for the future going ahead. Because we just don't. And it's been that way. I mean, obviously I brought this to Ryan Pichet long ago. And we've been poking him for a long time, and he developed the ad hoc, and we've moved forward with this. You saw this coming. This is the last thing. How do we sustain it so that when I need it, when my family needs it, when your family needs it, it's there. We don't have to worry about it. It's not a question of whether somebody's going to show up. It's going to be there. That's the goal. Who runs it? Who does it? I don't care. How do we get it done? That's the goal. And I've seen enough of it. I've sat behind the desk. I've done the numbers. I've lived it. I know what we're looking at. It's tough. I got nothing. I'll get you numbers.
Okay.
Those inter-facilities were very important to me because I had to look those up because it felt like...
Actually, you and I can talk about, I have them right here.
Did you get those directly from the ER? And because I got mine from Tracy, from Marcy.
We can talk about that on the side. Why don't we do that as a sidebar?
100%.
Other questions or comments? Thank you for your attention. Appreciate you being here and helping us as we did the study. I think you got about 40 minutes of sunlight left. And it's still 70 degrees out.
You did have a question.